At 10:15 in the morning on August 17, 1943, General Jagdflieger Adolf Galland stood at a railway platform departing Rinton Heath in East Prussia, watching Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring board his luxury train. They had just finished a conference about Luftwaffe fighter operations. Galland needed to deliver critical intelligence before Göring departed. The intelligence concerned American fighter aircraft appearing deep inside German airspace. Earlier that day on August 17th, Luftwaffe fighters had intercepted a massive American bomber raid targeting Regensburg in Schweinfurt. The engagement had followed predictable patterns. German fighters waited at the border. American escort fighters, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, turned back as expected once their fuel ran low. The bombers continued deeper into Germany without protection. Luftwaffe squadrons attacked. Then something unprecedented happened. More American fighters appeared. Not Thunderbolts, different aircraft. They engaged German fighters over 150 miles inside Germany, far beyond where any escort should have been able to reach. Galland had collected reports from squadron commanders across the Reich. The American fighters were LOHIT P-38 Lightnings, equipped with external drop tanks. The drop tanks extended their range dramatically. This changed everything. Galland approached Göring at the railway platform. He presented his findings directly. American fighters with extended range were penetrating deep into Germany. Squadron commanders reported P-38 Lightnings equipped with drop tanks engaging over Schweinfurt, over Regensburg, over targets that should have been far beyond escort range. The old tactical doctrine waiting for the escorts to turn back before striking the bombers was no longer viable. Göring listened, his face reddening, his voice rising. He declared that American fighters could not possibly have reached that far into Germany. The reports were wrong. The aircraft Galland described, Göring insisted, must have been damaged planes gliding eastward from great altitude after being hit over France or Belgium flukes. Anomalies, not proof of extended range. Galland protested. He explained the drop tank system. Multiple squadrons had reported identical encounters on the same day. These were not crippled aircraft. They were fighters in full combat power, engaging deep inside the Reich. Göring cut him off. The Reichsmarschall gave an order. Officially, American fighters had not crossed into central Germany. Galland understood instantly. Göring was denying reality. The Reich's Air Force would fight the coming battle blind. He smiled, a small. It's an unforgettable gesture that witnesses never forgot. Orders are orders, sir. As Göring's train departed, Galland watched it disappear down the track. He knew the Luftwaffe had just lost its last chance to prepare for the threat that would destroy it. What happened next would doom thousands of German pilots who would die fighting. An enemy their leaders insisted did not exist. The losses began almost immediately. After Göring dismissed Galland's warning, on August 17, 1943, very day of their confrontation at the railway platform, the Luftwaffe lost between 25 and 27 fighters during the Regensburg-Schweinfurt raids. Many were shot down by the long-range P-38 escorts Göring had declared impossible. The twin Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission proved exactly what Galland had warned of. American bombers penetrated deep into Germany under continuous fighter escort, far beyond any previously observed range. German interceptors that rose to attack the bomber. Streams were ambushed by P-38s diving from altitude, appearing at distances no one in the Reich air defense had thought reachable. From England, the fighting was savage. 60 American bombers were destroyed that day. But the Luftwaffe's own losses in aircraft and trained pilots were devastating. The mission marked a turning point. For the first time, German fighter leaders faced a reality in which American bombers could be protected throughout their entire penetration into the Reich. The fundamental tactical assumption that escorts would turn back at predictable limits was gone. 3 weeks later, on September 6, 1943, another disaster confirmed Galland's warnings. A formation of B-17s struck Stuttgart. Escorted once again by P-38s ranging deep into southern Germany, Major Egon Meyer of Jagdflieger, one of Germany's most successful bomber-destroyers with 57 kills, led the interception. Meyer had pioneered the head-on attack against American heavy bombers, exploiting the short exposure time to defensive fire. His squadron climbed to meet the approaching formation and executed the head-on pass as planned, scoring hits on several bombers. Then, from above and behind the bomber stream, the P-38 escorts struck. They had been waiting for exactly this moment. Meyer's formation scattered. 3 German fighters went down in the first pass. Meyer himself barely escaped when a P-38 locked onto his tail. He shoved his Messerschmitt Bf-109 into a steep dive and managed to outrun the heavier American fighter, but 5 of his squadron did not return. 3 pilots were killed, 2 captured after bailing out. Not a single bomber was confirmed destroyed. The mission was a complete failure. By October 1943, the pattern was unmistakable. American bombers were striking deep into Germany with fighter escorts that Göring had declared impossible. Yet the Luftwaffe continued to fight using tactics based on assumptions already proven false. Pilots were told that escorts could not reach certain targets. They planned their attacks accordingly. Then the escorts appeared and shot them down. On October 14, 1943, Black Thursday, another Schweinfurt raid, brought catastrophic losses for both sides. The Americans lost 60 bombers. The Luftwaffe lost 38 fighters, or pilots killed or wounded. On December 4, 1943, Hauptmann Wilhelm Lemke of Jagdflieger 3 was killed near Doetinchem in the Netherlands. Lemke, with 131 victories, was one of Germany's most accomplished aces. He fell in combat with P-47 Thunderbolts of the 352nd Fighter Group. He was 23 years old. The death of aces like Lemke represented an irreplaceable depletion of the Luftwaffe's combat effectiveness. Black Thursday revealed both the strength and the weakness of the American bombing offensive. The loss of 60 bombers in a single Dennerli, 9% of the attacking force meant 600 airmen killed or captured. Such losses were unsustainable without continuous fighter escort to the target and back. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids for several weeks after Black Thursday to rebuild its strength and await more long-range escorts. But for the Luftwaffe, the raid signaled something even darker. Despite achieving their highest bomber kill count of the war, German fighter losses were now approaching parity with the bombers they destroyed. The exchange rate was unsustainable. The Luftwaffe had destroyed 60 bombers, but lost 38 fighters and 42 pilots in the process. Before the advent of long-range escorts, the exchange rate had been 3 or 4 bombers destroyed for every fighter lost. Now, it was approaching 1-to-1. At that rate, the Luftwaffe would be ground down by attrition long before American bomber strength was seriously reduced. Galland understood the mathematics. In November 1943, he compiled another detailed report analyzing monthly fighter losses from June through October. 87 fighters lost, July 106, August 174, September -193, October 224. The trend was unmistakable. Losses were accelerating. Even worse, the proportion of experienced pilots was collapsing. In June, 60% of frontline fighter pilots had more than 6 months of combat experience. By October, only 40% did. The Luftwaffe was bleeding away its most irreplaceable asset, veteran pilots, who not only survived combat, but trained the next generation. Galland warned that, without immediate intervention, the fighter force would reach a critical breaking point within 6 months. Beyond that threshold, losses would outpace the training pipeline's capacity to produce replacements. The Jagdwaffe would enter a death spiral from which recovery would be impossible. He sent the report to Göring, to the Air Ministry, to anyone in the chain of command who might listen. The response was silence. Göring refused to acknowledge the crisis. The Air Ministry issued directives calling for improved morale and more aggressive tactics. No one addressed the fundamental problem. German pilots were now outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outmatched by better-trained Allied opponents flying superior. Long-range fighters. Galland documented every loss. He compiled reports. He sent weekly summaries to Göring and the High Command. Each was clear, factual, and precise. Each described a tactical situation deteriorating beyond recovery. American fighters, with extended range, were now escorting bombers across the breadth of Germany. The old doctrine waiting for the escorts to turn back before attacking was obsolete. New tactics were needed immediately. Fighter production had to increase. Pilot training had to expand. And above all, the Me-262 jet fighter had to be rushed into service, despite its development problems. Its speed advantage offered the only realistic chance to penetrate. Escort screens and strike the bombers themselves. Galland made this clear in every report. He sent memoranda, recommendations, urgent appeals. Göring did not reply. The Reichsmarschall had made his decision months earlier. In August, American long-range fighters were not a strategic threat. The Luftwaffe would continue current operations. Nothing would change. But everything was about to change. Through November and December 1943, the situation deteriorated rapidly as American fighter capabilities expanded beyond even what Galland had warned. Then, on December 1st, 1943, something new appeared over Germany, something that made the P-38 threat seem manageable by comparison. The North American P-51 Mustang had arrived. The P-51 had existed for 2 years, serving in various roles. The Royal Air Force used early models for low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack. The U.S. Army Air Forces employed them in North Africa and the Mediterranean. But those early Mustangs carried the Allison engine, which lost power above 15,000 feet. They could not escort bombers in the stratosphere. Where the air war over Germany was fought, German intelligence knew these early Mustangs. Luftwaffe analysts had concluded they posed no threat to high-altitude bomber operations. Then North American Aviation installed the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the Mustang airframe. The Merlin's 2-stage supercharger maintained full power above 30,000 feet. The result was extraordinary. An American fighter that could fly as high as any German aircraft, faster than most at altitude. Agile enough to dogfight on equal terms. With twice the range of any escort the Luftwaffe had faced before. With 2 external drop tanks. The P-51 could fly more than 800 miles from base, engage in combat over its target, and return home. Berlin lay just 600 miles from England. For the first time, the bombers could be escorted to the heart of the Reich and back again. Every industrial target in Germany was now within reach of escorted daylight bombing. On December 1st, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group flew the first P-51B combat mission over Europe from Boxted Airfield in England. The unit had received its aircraft only days earlier, having trained on P-39 Erokobruce in the United States. Many pilots had less than 5 hours in the new fighter before their first mission. But the P-51 proved intuitive and forgiving. It responded crisply to control inputs, accelerated rapidly, and could sustain high-speed maneuvers without bleeding energy. Pilots who had flown P-47 Thunderbolts said the Mustang felt like a fighter half its weight. On December 5th, the group escorted bombers to Amiens in northern France. On December 11th, they reached Emden on the German coast. Then, on December 13th, 1943, they achieved a breakthrough that changed the air war permanently. 50-5 P-51 Mustangs escorted B-17 bombers, 2 Kiel, 480 miles from England, 240 miles inside Germany. The mission lasted 4.5 hours. Over the target, the Mustangs engaged Luftwaffe interceptors and shot down 6 German fighters without loss. American bombers struck the U-boat construction yards with minimal interference. The mission proved beyond doubt that American heavy bombers could now reach any target in Germany with continuous fighter protection. The escort problem that had plagued the strategic bombing campaign since 1942 was solved. Galland recognized the threat instantly. He flew to Berlin in late December to meet with Göring. In his briefcase were intelligence summaries on the P-51 technical specifications, performance data, and combat reports from German pilots who had already encountered the new fighter. The facts were inescapable. The P-51 was faster than both the Bf-19 and the Focke-Wulf 190 at all altitudes. It could turn with German fighters and outclimb them above 20,000 feet. With external drop tanks, it could reach any target in the Reich. Galland recommended immediate emergency measures. Fighter production had to become the nation's top industrial priority. The Me-262 jet program should receive full support and be deployed as a fighter, not delayed as a bomber project. Pilot training needed to accelerate, fuel shortages or not. Germany had to adapt or face strategic defeat in the air war. Göring dismissed the warning. The Reichsmarschall insisted the P-51 was just another American fighter. German pilots were superior. German tactics were superior. The Luftwaffe would prevail through skill and courage, Galland argued. He showed Göring the intelligence reports, the loss statistics, the pilot accounts. He explained exactly what would happen once P-51s escorted bombers to Berlin. Göring refused to listen. The meeting ended. Galland returned to his headquarters knowing the Luftwaffe had sealed its own fate. Through January and February 1944, the American strategic bombing campaign intensified. P-51 Mustangs appeared in growing numbers, escorting bombers to Frankfurt, Leipzig, and targets across central Germany. Luftwaffe losses climbed steadily. Then, on February 20, 1944, the Americans launched Operation Argument Later, known as Big Week 6 Days of Relentless attacks on German aircraft production centers. The objective was twofold: to cripple the Luftwaffe's industrial base and to draw its fighter force into open battle, where it could be destroyed. Over 3,500 American bombers struck targets throughout Germany. Escorted by swarms of P-38s, P-47s, and the increasingly dominant P-51s, the Luftwaffe committed everything it had. Every available fighter squadron was thrown into the battle. Veteran aces flew multiple sorties per day. Inexperienced pilots, some with barely a dozen flight hours, were rushed into combat. The cost was catastrophic. During Big Week, the Luftwaffe lost 262 fighters destroyed and another 180 damaged beyond immediate repair. Pilot casualties were even more devastating. Approximately 100 killed, 90 wounded, and 43 missing. Among the dead were squadron commanders, group leaders, and veteran aces, the irreplaceable core of Germany's air defense. Major Egon Meyer, who had survived the disastrous Stuttgart interception the previous September, was killed on March 2, 1944, shot down by P-47 escorts over France. He had 102 victories. He was 29 years old. Hauptmann Kurt Ubahn of Jagdflieger 3 was killed on February 22 during an interception over Brunswick. He had 110 kills. He was 24. These were not novices. They were the backbone of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, the men who carried its doctrine, its skill, its spirit, and one by one they were being erased from the sky. The result was visible in every combat report. New pilots failed to maintain formation, missed radio calls, and became disoriented in clouds or under attack. Many never fired their guns in anger. Some crashed on takeoff or landing. Others bailed out on their first mission. Squadron leaders wrote bitterly that they were commanding boys, not pilots. Galland tried to reform the system, to increase flight hours, to pull instructors back from combat. But there was no time, and no fuel, and no one left to teach. By spring 1944, Luftwaffe fighter groups were shells of their former strength. Units that had once fielded 40 serviceable aircraft now flew 15, sometimes fewer. Maintenance crews worked through the night to keep damaged fighters operational. Pilots slept in their cockpits between sorties. Every day brought new orders to intercept bomber streams that grew larger, higher, and better protected. Every day more pilots failed to return. The American strategy was working exactly as planned. The bomber offensive was not just destroying factories, it was destroying the Luftwaffe itself. With every mission, the balance of skill and experience tilted further toward the Allies. By the summer of 1944, German air defense was no longer a shield. It was a sacrifice. No part of German airspace was safe anymore. Luftwaffe pilots took off knowing American fighters might already be above their airfields. The climb to altitude became a battle in itself. Some were shot down before even reaching their assigned formations. Others returned to find their bases under attack. Ground crews worked under constant threat, repairing aircraft while machine gun fire swept the runways. By March 1944, American fighter sweeps extended from the Rhine to Berlin. The Luftwaffe was forced to disperse its squadrons to smaller, improvised fields with limited facilities. Maintenance suffered. Supply chains broke down. Replacement aircraft arrived without spare parts. Replacement pilots without proper instruction. Even the weather seemed to conspire against them. Grounding operations while the bombers continued to advance eastward under cover of escort fighters, Galland saw clearly what was happening. The air war had shifted from a contest of machines to a contest of endurance. And Germany was running out of everything that mattered. Fuel, pilots, time. The Luftwaffe could still inflict damage, could still kill, but it could no longer win. The skies over Europe now belonged to the Americans. Galland's report was blunt, clinical, and damning. It warned that continued losses at the present rate would render the fighter arm incapable of organized resistance within 3 months. Fuel stocks were critically low. Training programs were non-existent in practical terms. Maintenance personnel were exhausted, and aircraft serviceability was falling below 50%. Every squadron was under strength. Every pilot was flying too often, sleeping too little, and fighting with diminishing hope of survival. He concluded with a stark assessment. Unless immediate measures were taken, massive diversion of fuel to training, withdrawal of veterans to serve as instructors, and concentration of all available aircraft for defense of the Reich, the Luftwaffe would cease to exist as an effective force. The report was circulated quietly, read by senior officers, and ignored. Göring dismissed it as defeatism. Hitler, when briefed on its contents, ordered that morale among pilots must be improved, and instructed propaganda units to emphasize the introduction of new miracle fighters that would soon turn the tide. The miracle never came. The Me-262 remained trapped in bureaucratic paralysis and design delays. Jet squadrons that might have changed the balance in 1943 were still months from readiness in 1944. Meanwhile, the destruction of Germany's air defenses accelerated. By May, American fighter sweeps ranged daily over central Germany. Industrial centers were burning. Railways were paralyzed. Fuel refineries were collapsing under attack. The Luftwaffe had lost not just the battle for the air, it had lost the ability to fight one. Galland wrote in his report that, at this point, he would have preferred a single Me-262 in action rather than 5 Bf-109s. The Me-262, the jet fighter he had long advocated deploying, was faster than any Allied fighter by 100 miles per hour. It could have penetrated escort screens and attacked bombers with impunity, but Hitler had insisted it be developed as a bomber rather than a fighter. Precious months were wasted converting it to carry bombs instead of maximizing its potential as an interceptor. By the time Hitler reversed his decision in late 1944 and allowed jet fighter production to focus on air defense, it was too late to stop the hemorrhaging of the Luftwaffe. Losses continued through the spring and summer of 1944. Between January and May, 2,262 German fighter pilots were killed, wounded, or went missing. March alone brought catastrophic attrition. Entire squadrons were decimated. Jagdflieger 11 lost 28 pilots in 3 weeks. Jagdflieger 3 lost 31. These were elite units with years of combat experience, shattered against overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. The numbers told the story of annihilation. Germany could lose 10 fighters and struggle to replace them within a month. The Americans could lose 100 and replace them within days. The British could lose 50 bombers and have them replaced within a week. Industrial capacity was unequal. Pilot training was unequal. The strategic situation was unequal. Germany was losing a war of attrition it could never win. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. the Luftwaffe was expected to contest the landings with massive fighter and bomber strikes. Luftflotte 3, responsible for defending France, had 481 aircraft available on June 5th. On D-Day itself, it flew 319 sorties. The Allies flew 14,674. The disparity was so complete that many Allied soldiers did not see a single German aircraft during the first week of the invasion. German pilots who did attempt to attack the invasion fleet faced walls of anti-aircraft fire and swarms of Allied fighters. Few survived. The Normandy campaign marked the final collapse of Luftwaffe effectiveness in the West. Obolt, Joseph Priller, commander of Jagdflieger 26, was one of Germany's most successful fighter leaders, with 101 kills, including 68 Spitfires, the highest score against that aircraft type. On D-Day morning, Priller and his wingman, Feldwebel Heinz Vink, were the only German pilots to attack the invasion beaches directly. Flying to Focke-Wulf FW-190s from Lille at extremely low altitude to avoid detection, they strafed Sword Beach before returning to base. Their two aircraft constituted the entire German fighter response to the largest amphibious invasion in history. Priller later described the mission as suicidal but necessary, a statement that reflected both courage and desperation. He survived the war, dying in 1961. The weeks after D-Day saw some of the most desperate and futile air combat of the entire conflict. Luftwaffe units threw themselves against overwhelming Allied air power in doomed attempts to support German ground forces. Losses were staggering. By the end of June 1944, the Luftwaffe had lost over 300 fighters in the West. July losses exceeded 400. August losses approached 500. Aircraft production, paradoxically, was not the limiting factor. By mid-1944, German factories were producing over 1,500 fighters per month. But production could not overcome the collapse of the operational system. Fuel shortages prevented proper pilot training. Experienced pilots were too few to operate the new aircraft effectively. Spare parts were scarce. Maintenance facilities were being bombed. Even when aircraft could be made operational, they rarely survived more than a handful of missions before being shot down. By July, Galland was receiving casualty reports showing 50 fighter pilots killed or missing every single day. 50 pilots per day. In contrast, Luftwaffe pilot training schools graduated approximately 30 pilots per week. The gap between losses and replacements was now a chasm. The mathematics of annihilation were simple and stark. There was no way to sustain operations at these loss rates. The fighter force was dying. Squadron commanders reported that new pilots arriving from training were effectively helpless in combat. They lacked basic skills. They could not maintain formation, panicked under fire, and made fundamental errors that got themselves and their wingman killed. One experienced squadron leader compared receiving fresh pilots in mid-1944 to executing them. Sending these undertrained men into combat against seasoned American and British pilots was tantamount to murder, but there was no choice. Germany had no reserve of trained pilots. Every trainee who completed school was sent immediately to the front and died within weeks. Galland tried everything. He pushed for increased production of the Me-262 jet. He advocated for improved training programs, even though fuel shortages made extensive preparation impossible. He developed new tactics for engaging heavily escorted bomber formations. He personally flew unauthorized combat missions to understand the conditions his pilots faced and to test new approaches. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem was not tactics, training, or equipment. It was numbers. The Americans and British had achieved air superiority through overwhelming numerical advantage. Backed by superior training, logistics, and virtually unlimited industrial capacity, Germany could no longer compete. No amount of German tactical innovation could overcome the strategic reality. Some pilots recognized what was happening and tried to adapt. Oberst Johann Steinhoff commanded Jagdflieger 77. Through much of 1944, an experienced leader who eventually achieved 176 kills. Steinhoff understood immediately that old tactics would not work against the new American escorts. He developed aggressive approaches, His squadrons would not wait for escorts to turn back. They would attack immediately, engaging the fighters first to drive them away from the bombers. The tactics were bold. They were effective in part. Steinhoff's unit shot down more enemy aircraft than average, but the cost was enormous. For every 2 enemy planes destroyed, JG-77 lost nearly 2 fighters. At that rate, no unit could sustain operations for more than a few months. The best German pilots were dying. The most innovative commanders were being killed. Every measure of skill, courage, and tactical genius was being eroded by the relentless arithmetic of attrition. The tactical knowledge, built over years of combat, was disappearing, and there was no one left with enough experience to replace it. Galland experienced the futility firsthand on an unauthorized mission in the spring of 1944, flying a Focke-Wulf FW-190 over Magdeburg. He wanted to see what his pilots faced from the cockpit rather than from reports. Ahead, a massive bomber formation loomed, escorted by at least 50 fighters, primarily P-51 Mustangs. Flying in loose formations above and alongside the bombers, Galland picked out a bomber on the edge of the formation and rolled into an attack. Just as he began to position for the shot, traces streaked past his canopy, for Mustangs had dived from above. He broke hard and dove. The Mustangs followed relentlessly. Using a trick from earlier in the war, Galland fired his machine guns forward, creating streams of smoke that drifted back toward the pursuing fighters, simulating return fire from the bomber. The Mustangs broke into a climbing turn. Galland seized the moment, diving away and escaping at high speed. He returned to base without firing a single shot at the bombers. He had been in position for less than 5 seconds before being engaged by the escorts. The lesson was immediate and unmistakable. American escorts were everywhere. Aggressive, skilled, and outnumbered German fighters by margins that made success impossible. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe fighter force existed primarily on paper. There were squadrons listed in organizational charts. There were pilots. There were aircraft being produced, but there was no cohesive fighter arm capable of defending German airspace. Fuel shortages grounded entire units for days. New pilots crashed during training because they had insufficient flight hours. Aircraft sat idle on airfields for lack of spare parts. When squadrons did manage to launch missions, they faced overwhelming numbers of Allied fighters and bombers. On November 2, 1944, Galland sent 500 fighters against 975 American bombers attacking oil plants. Escorted by 800 fighters, 600 of them P-51 Mustangs. The Americans shot down 98 German fighters, killing 78 pilots. They lost only 50 aircraft, 30 of them to anti-aircraft fire. Germany could no longer afford such losses. Hitler and Göring were furious. With the Ardennes offensive being planned for December, Hitler ordered Galland to prepare his fighter reserves to support the ground attack, rather than defend the Reich elite fighter wings that had fought for years would now be shifted to support a doomed ground offensive. Galland knew that his planned grosser slug the big blow against American bomber formations was finished. In January 1945, Galland was relieved of his command as General der Jagdflieger. On January 13th, Göring blamed him for the Luftwaffe's failures. His constant complaints, his defeatist reports, and his criticism of leadership. He told staff that Galland had undermined morale and failed to inspire his pilots to achieve victory through willpower alone. The relief came in the aftermath of the fighter pilots' revolt. When several senior commanders had met with Göring to express grievances about the conduct of the air war, Galland was accused of orchestrating the meeting to undermine Göring's authority. He was placed under house arrest at his hunting lodge and faced the threat of court-martial law, even execution. The SS and Gestapo opened files on him, monitoring his every move. Heinrich Himmler sought to put Galland on trial for treason, but Hitler intervened. The Führer respected Galland's reputation as a skilled combat pilot and leader. He also recognized that court-martialing Germany's most famous fighter ace would be a propaganda disaster. Hitler allowed Galland to return to active duty on one condition: he would form and command Jagdverband 44, an elite jet fighter unit equipped with Me-262 aircraft. The unit would be manned by the best surviving fighter pilots in Germany. Galland accepted immediately. He gathered 10 holders of the Knight's Cross, experienced aces who had survived years of combat. Among them were Johann Steinhoff with 176 kills, Gerhard Barkhorn with 301, and Heinrich Bohr with 220. These were some of the most successful fighter pilots in history. The Me-262 jets began. Arriving in late February and March 1945, the aircraft were everything Galland had claimed. They would be magnificent, fast, and deadly. Top speed: 540 miles per hour to 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter. Armament: for 30mm cannons with devastating firepower. Climb: 30,000 feet in 7 minutes. The jet engines gave acceleration that piston-engine fighters could not match. In combat, the Me-262 could choose when to engage and when to disengage. Allied fighters could not catch it in level flight or in a dive. The only way to shoot down a Me-262 was to intercept it during takeoff or landing when it was slow and vulnerable, or to inflict catastrophic damage in a head-on pass that left the pilot unable to control the jet. Allied pilots quickly adapted, patrolling near no Me-262 bases and attacking jets during their most vulnerable moments. This led to fierce battles around German airfields as conventional fighters tried desperately to protect the jets. Galland flew his first combat mission in the Me-262 on March 31, 1945, launching from Munich Airfield. He intercepted a formation of American bombers near Nuremberg. Galland shot down a B-26 Marauder with a short burst from his 30mm cannons. The bomber disintegrated under the concentrated firepower. Over the next 4 weeks, he added 6 more kills, all heavy bombers. His squadron, Jagdflieger 44, destroyed 45 Allied bombers and fighters during March and April 1945, but it made no difference to the outcome of the war. Germany was collapsing from all directions. Soviet forces were fighting in the streets of Berlin. British and American troops had crossed the Rhine and were advancing rapidly through western Germany. German cities lay in ruins from years of strategic bombing. Fuel supplies had essentially vanished. Aviation gasoline production had collapsed after Allied attacks on synthetic fuel plants. Even elite jet units were grounded for days due to lack of fuel. Jagdflieger 44 flew its last combat mission on April 26, 1945. Galland led 12 Me-262s from Munich to intercept American bombers. At approximately 1,500 hours while engaging a formation south of Munich, Galland's aircraft was hit by fire from a P-47 Thunderbolt piloted by First Lieutenant James Finnegan of the 56th Fighter Group. The attack came at a vulnerable moment. As Galland was focused on lining up a shot against a bomber, he heard and felt the impacts. .50 caliber rounds tore through the canopy and instrument panel. Both engines were hit. Metal splinters from the destroyed panel struck his right knee, sending a sharp pain through his kneecap. The aircraft was severely damaged, but still flyable. Galland broke off the attack and dove away from the combat area, carefully nursing the crippled Me-262 back toward Munich. Both engines ran rough and were losing power. The instrument panel was destroyed, leaving him to fly largely by feel, managing the aircraft's critical systems as best he could. Galland flew by feel, relying on landmarks to navigate. At low altitude, with an almost uncontrollable aircraft, he managed to crash land near the airfield. X-rays taken later showed 2 metal splinters embedded in his kneecap. The injury was not life-threatening, but it was severe enough that he could no longer continue flying. He was removed from command due to his injuries, and Johann Steinhoff assumed leadership of Jagdflieger 44. 8 days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The April 26th mission was notable for another reason. It may have been the last time a German fighter ace of Galland's stature flew in combat. His final victory count stood at 104, all against Western Allied aircraft. Over 6 years of war, he had flown 705 combat missions, been shot down 4 times, and survived each. He had commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter arm during its most critical period and had tried desperately to reform a system that was fundamentally broken. He had failed not through lack of skill or effort, but because the strategic situation was unwinnable and leadership had refused to accept reality in 1979. 34 years after the war, Galland met First Lieutenant James Finnegan at an Air Force Association meeting in San Francisco. A graduate student had matched Finnegan's combat report with German records and arranged the meeting. The two men talked for hours about their engagement. Finnegan described seeing the Me-262 making its attack run on the bombers and positioning his P-47 for a shot. Galland recounted feeling the hits and struggling to keep the damaged jet airborne long enough to reach friendly territory. They discussed the aircraft, the tactics, and the experience of combat. There was mutual respect between them. Both had been professional military pilots, doing their duty in a terrible war. The meeting was filmed and later became an important historical document, one of the rare occasions where a pilot and the man who shot him down met decades later to discuss the engagement in detail. Adolf Galland survived the war. He was captured by Allied forces and remained a prisoner until 1947. After his release, he served as a military advisor to the Argentine Air Force for 6 years. He returned to Germany in 1955 and worked as an aerospace consultant. In 1954, he published his autobiography, The First and Only, detailing his experiences as General der Jagdflieger and his conflicts with Göring and Hitler over air strategy. The book became one of the most important primary sources on Luftwaffe operations. Galland lived until 1996, dying at the age of 83. Throughout his later life, historians repeatedly asked him about the turning point of the air war. When did he know Germany would lose? Galland consistently pointed to August 1943. It was the moment he had tried to warn Göring about long-range American fighters penetrating deep into Germany. He knew then that the Luftwaffe faced a threat it could not overcome if leadership refused to adapt. He had presented evidence. He had recommended immediate action, and Göring had given him a direct order. No such threat existed. That decision, Galland argued in later years, cost Germany any chance of maintaining air superiority. If the Luftwaffe had adapted in August 1943, when P-38s with drop tanks first appeared, different outcomes might have been possible. Resources could have been redirected to jet fighter production before it was too late. Training programs could have been expanded before fuel shortages made them impossible. Tactics could have been developed to counter the numerical superiority of Allied fighters before the pilot corps was decimated, but Göring had refused to acknowledge the threat. He called it impossible and ordered Galland to stop reporting such intelligence. By the time the crisis became undeniable, it was far too late. The Luftwaffe fighter force had been shattered. Thousands of pilots were dead, the most experienced leaders gone, and the training pipeline had collapsed. Germany lost air superiority over its own territory and never regained it. Allied strategic bombing continued unopposed through 1945. German cities burned. Factories were destroyed. Transportation networks collapsed. Oil production fell to levels that grounded entire air units. The war became unwinnable not because Germany lacked courage or skill, but because it had lost control of its own airspace situation that traced directly back to August 1943, when a general had tried to warn his commander about a threat that was dismissed by an order. Denying reality, Galland never received official recognition for his warnings. No commendation, no acknowledgement that he had been correct. Official Luftwaffe records attributed the collapse of the fighter force to overwhelming Allied numerical superiority and insufficient German resources. Galland's name appeared only as the officer responsible for fighter operations during the period of decline. There was no mention that he had predicted the crisis. No mention that he had recommended solutions months before they became desperately needed. No mention that he had been ignored by leadership that preferred comfortable assumptions over uncomfortable facts. After the war, military historians researching the Luftwaffe found extensive documentation of Galland's August 1943 confrontation with Göring. They uncovered the railway platform exchange recorded in multiple sources, including memoirs by Albert Speer, who had witnessed part of the conversation. They found Galland's intelligence reports about long-range American fighters. They found Göring's dismissive responses and his order asserting that no such threat existed. They found subsequent combat reports proving that American fighters were indeed penetrating deep into Germany, exactly as Galland had warned. The historians interviewed surviving Luftwaffe pilots. Almost all confirmed similar experiences. They had been told repeatedly that American fighters could not reach certain distances into Germany. They were told to wait for escorts to turn back before attacking bombers. They were told the losses were temporary and would improve. The losses never improved. They grew worse every month until the Luftwaffe essentially ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Military. Analysts concluded that Göring's refusal to accept Galland's intelligence in August 1943 was one of the most consequential command failures of the entire war. By denying reality, Göring ensured that the Luftwaffe would be unprepared for the threat that ultimately destroyed it. Had Germany taken Galland's warnings seriously, the outcome of the air war might not have changed dramatically, but the Luftwaffe could at least have been in a position to fight more effectively and possibly delay its collapse. The Allies had overwhelming industrial and numerical superiority, regardless of any German tactical adaptations. Yet the war might have been longer and more costly for the Allies, perhaps. Months of additional time for Germany to develop countermeasures. Perhaps significantly higher Allied aircrew casualties. Perhaps different strategic calculations if bomber losses had remained prohibitively high, even with fighter escort. But none of those possibilities were explored, because Göring dismissed the warning and ordered his fighter commander to stop making such reports. This is how command failures manifest in war, not through dramatic betrayals or obvious incompetence, but through the refusal to accept uncomfortable intelligence, through dismissing evidence that contradicts existing assumptions, through punishing subordinates who report problems instead of addressing the problems themselves, through giving orders that deny reality rather than adapting to changed circumstances. Adolf Galland tried to warn his superiors. He presented facts. He recommended solutions. He was ignored, and thousands of German pilots died as a result. Fighting an enemy they had been told did not exist until it was far too late to mount an effective defense. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. You are part of something special. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.